Hola, hola! Welcome to my very first YouTube video. Got my skeleton cup, I've got my little jack-o'-lantern themed headscarf because Halloween is forever alive in our hearts. Am I right? I'm right. Cheers. I've tried to film this intro a million fucking times and I'm just gonna keep this cavalier. I'm not gonna try and make this sound super scripted like most YouTubers do. I'm sure that I'll get the hang of it later on, but for now, yeah, it's just gonna be chill. Guess I'll start by introducing myself. I've gone by a variety of names, but for the sake of consistency, you may call me Kat or Katarina, whichever you prefer, whatever you vibe with. And I've been feeling pretty drawn to starting a YouTube channel for a while now. And basically the content I'm going to be releasing on this channel will revolve around all things strange and unusual, such as paranormal activity, unexplained mysteries of the world, whether they be paranormal, extraterrestrial, otherwise, some true crime sprinkled in there, bizarre oddities, just weird shit, just all the weirdness. And I know that a lot of you guys find that shit just as fascinating as I do. I'm gonna try not to look down a lot, but this is a pretty lengthy story, and for that reason I'm gonna be cutting this video into two parts. So we'll be talking today about Dorothy Eady and the story of her life, and this is going to be a reincarnation story actually, which I find absolutely fucking fascinating. I'm a firm believer in reincarnation, and if you aren't, if you're a skeptic, I just encourage you to listen to this story and then tell me what your opinion is, because among all of the reincarnation stories I've heard about or looked into thus far, I really find this one to be the most compelling, because a common denominator that you will see in reincarnation stories, it's like age 2 to 6 that children will have these past life memories surface in their vividity and like their strength, like they're very intense and they're very there, and they're vocal about them. But unfortunately, as they grow up and they become societally conditioned, a little bit more spiritually jaded, etc., they kind of forget these memories. They just slowly fade farther and farther away until they have little to no recollection of these past life events. Or at the very least, they become less vocal about it and they choose not to allow that to affect their present life, and they just, I don't know, sort of dismiss it as just being what it was back then and leave it alone. But this story is very different. Dorothy Eady, her past life experience completely shaped her life, the direction of her life, like where she ended up living, everything. So she believes to have been the reincarnation of Sety, who was the priestess of the Nile in ancient Egypt. And I'm fascinated by ancient Egyptian shit in general too, so that's another reason why this story is just so fucking cool. Like I said, I'm gonna try not to look down a lot, but I want to get the information as accurate as I can, so I will be. So Dorothy was born in 1904 to a lower middle class family in London, England, and she was pretty much just a normal kid until one fateful day in 1908, when she was only 4 years old, that she fell down the stairs in her family home. Now, this accident in the moment was very intense. It was thought to have been fatal. The doctor checked her vital signs. Of course, medical technology was extremely minimal back then, so all he really did was he grabbed a mirror and a feather, sort of put it under her nose to see if she was breathing, and there was no indication that she was breathing. So he pronounced her dead. And her parents were, of course, very distraught, very upset, sobbing, and the doctor leaves the room to retrieve a nurse so that they can go and collect Dorothy's body to take to the funeral home. This takes about half an hour, and upon him returning to the room, he's just shocked and astounded to see that Dorothy is sitting up straight in her bed. Miraculously, she's regained consciousness. She's singing, playing to herself, singing to herself and playing just like a happy kid, just basically acting as though nothing ever happened. And he examined her further and said that she, or at least it appeared that she had not sustained any severe injuries from this, and that she was totally fucking fine, which is bizarre, right? When just half an hour prior, he said that she was dead, like dead. So she would never return to being that innocent, simple little child that her parents knew so very well. She began to adopt some very strange behaviors. She would hide under tables, behind couches, and just sob and cry as if she were bewildered and frightened by seemingly unfamiliar surroundings, and she would just cry and beg to be taken home. When her parents explained to her repeatedly, Dorothy, you are home, she simply did not accept this. She also started having really intense recurring dreams, and in these recurring dreams, she would see beautiful, large temples, which she described in great detail, buildings with vast stone columns surrounded by rich vegetation and wide open gardens. And one day, her parents decided to go on an outing to the British Museum in London, and they didn't exactly plan on bringing Dorothy along, but they couldn't find a babysitter, so, what are you gonna do? You gotta take the kiddo with you. And as you can imagine, a museum is not an ideal place for a young child. She was bored, restless, kind of stir-crazy, just completely uninterested in any of the exhibits. That was until they approached the Egyptian exhibit. And Dorothy's face just lit up, like something resonated deeply within her, and she ran up to the statues of the Egyptian gods and goddesses and just started profusely kissing their feet. And she even spoke angrily at surrounding guests for wearing their shoes in the presence of such gods. She also curled at the foot of a mummy enclosed in glass and absolutely refused to leave it. She just sat there, staring blankly at its face, and responded to no one. After about 30 minutes of this, maybe an hour, her mother tried to pick her up and bring her home, tell her, hey, Dorothy, it's time to leave. We have to go home now. She absolutely had a meltdown, screamed, cried, and the creepy part about this is that according to her mother, she took on a voice that did not sound like her own. Her voice sounded very old, for lack of a better word, just aged, not like that of a small child. And in this voice, she said, I want to be left with my people. And apparently it just took a lot of kicking and screaming to get her out of that museum. And these changes in her voice actually continued throughout her childhood. She would sort of go in and out of this foreign accent that her parents did not recognize whatsoever, and it really seemed as though Dorothy didn't even realize that she was doing it. It just kind of flowed from her naturally. So fast forward a little bit, it is now 1911. Dorothy is 7 years old, and her parents hoped and thought that perhaps by this point that she would go back to normal and that they would be able to dismiss all of this as just a phase, a crazy series of stories conjured up by the imaginative mind of a rambunctious child. However, that was definitely not the case, and her strange behaviors only increased. One day, while passing a bookshop on his way home, her father Reuben picked up an edition of the Children's Encyclopedia, and in this particular edition there was an article on the Rosetta Stone, which really piqued Dorothy's interest. The volume was constantly left open to this one specific article, and Dorothy would often leave a magnifying glass beside it that she would use to try and decipher the hieroglyphics on the image. And when her mother asked her why she was trying to read words that were not in English, she replied by simply saying, I know it, I've forgotten it, but perhaps I might remember it. Then shortly after that, Dorothy was reading a magazine of her father's and stumbled across a photo of the temple built by Sety I, which was an ancient Egyptian temple built for the pharaoh Sety, the son of Ramses I, in Abydos, which is the capital of Upper Egypt, about 7 miles west of the Nile River, I believe. And she immediately told her father that this temple was her real home, and this was a conviction that she never lost as she grew older. She did point out, however, that there were some missing elements in this photograph. She said that the gardens were missing. And she included details such as the vines, trees, and vast lotus gardens that existed thousands of years before the ruins were rediscovered. And later on, she also set eyes on a photo of the mummified body of Sety himself, and even in his mummified state, she said that she could recognize him. She knew his face, and she said that she had known him before, and that he was a very, very kind man. From this point on, Dorothy completely dedicated herself to learning as much as she possibly could about her past life and where her soul originated from. And of course, this was much to the dismay of her parents. They did not appreciate her strange behavior. For example, she absolutely refused to wear shoes, and she became very irate and upset when they forced them upon her. And at her Sunday school, she rejected Christianity entirely, claiming that it was just a pale imitation of the ancient Egyptian religion, which, in my opinion, she's not wrong. Now, although Dorothy did reject Christianity, she did enjoy attending Catholic services because it reminded her of the old religion, as she referred to it, with the burning of the incense and the ritualistic nature of the services. But when a preacher asked her, just straight up, if she was Christian, and she said, no, of course not, he made a visit to her home and lectured her parents on how they needed to get her off of this path to hell, and that she was absolutely banned from all church services until they did this. And she was also expelled from her school after throwing a hymn book at one of her teachers because she scolded Dorothy for refusing to sing a hymn that included the line, "Curse the swart Egyptians." At this point, her parents were leaning towards more extreme measures, and they threatened to send her to a convent school in Belgium. However, this threat completely backfired on them because Dorothy simply said that she would just run away, and that traveling to Egypt would be much easier from Belgium than from London. So this caused her parents to back away from that threat and keep her home at the risk of her running away to Egypt. So at the age of 10, Dorothy became quite tired of school, completely uninterested, and she started skipping classes frequently to spend time in the Egyptian exhibit in the London Museum, where her past life visions were originally kindled. It was here that she met a man named Ernest Wallace Budge, who was a respected Egyptologist and collector of Egyptian and Syrian antiquities at the British Museum. He taught Dorothy how to read Egyptian hieroglyphics, and he was absolutely astounded with how easily she seemed to pick it up, because it is not an easy language to learn. These symbols are quite complex, so he was just flabbergasted at how this young child was able to pick up on it so quickly. Eventually, after Dorothy had committed several hundred of these pictographs to memory, he asked her how she was able to learn so much so fast, to which she replied, "I've known this all before. It's all coming back to me now." This was a very exciting period in Dorothy's life. She was gaining all of this information. She was inching closer and closer to developing a deeper understanding of this past life that she firmly believed that she lived, this past life that was following her and almost haunting her, just with this deep yearning, a yearning to understand. However, unfortunately, as Dorothy turned 12 years old just after the First World War broke out and the bombing raids became a lot more frequent in London, the museum that Dorothy spent so much time studying in and came to love was closed down. At this point, Dorothy was sent to Sussex to live on her aunt's farm. But she was not going to give up on her pursuit of knowledge. She rode one of the farm horses every single day 7 miles to the nearest library to read all of the books that she possibly could about Egypt. In 1918, Dorothy returned to London, and what happens next is best described in her own words. While she was sleeping one night, she received her next long-awaited clue about her previous life. "I half woke up, feeling weight on my chest. Then I fully woke up and saw this face bending over me with both hands on the neck of my nightdress. I recognized the face from the photo I had seen years before of the mummy Sety. I was astonished and shocked. I cried out. I was overjoyed. I can remember it as if it was yesterday, but still is so difficult to explain. It was the feeling of something you've waited for that's come at last. After this, Dorothy began also having recurring dreams of standing in a dark room, thick with the smell of incense, and a decorated man questioning her aggressively and beating her. Dorothy would wake up screaming in complete disarray, and her parents rushed in to console her each time. Dorothy was quite perplexed, almost more curious than she was afraid at this point about what the significance was of these strange dreams. Her parents, however, felt much differently about it. They committed her for psychological evaluations on mental hospitals on several occasions, but all of her stays ended up being quite brief because they never found anything to actually be psychologically wrong with her. All of her test results indicated no abnormalities. At the age of 16, she was no longer enforced by law to attend school, which she took full advantage of and fully committed herself to her studies of all things Egyptian. Her father was keen to follow his own path of self-discovery and had recently quit his job as a master tailor to pursue his hunch that moving pictures would be a lucrative business in the coming years. Which, of fucking course, it blew up. Movies, hello. The family began touring around England, and Dorothy would stop at each town's library to read books about Egypt that she hadn't previously read. They eventually settled in Plymouth, where her father built a large Cinemark. The Eadys lived on a flat above this Cinemark, and Reuben did end up being correct in his hunch, as I said. They ended up being pretty successful, and this raised their family's value economically by a significant degree. But Dorothy, however, had no interest in the cinema and enlisted in art school. As she grew into a young adult, she expanded her philosophical horizons and began investigating the concept of reincarnation. She even joined a group dedicated to people sharing their past life stories, as well as a number of other spiritual groups. But when Dorothy shared her story with this group, they actually theorized that her being reincarnated was unlikely. They were more prone to believe that she did die when she fell down the stairs and that her vessel became open to possession, which I suppose could also be a possibility, but Dorothy completely detested this, of course, and after that she abandoned all of these groups and returned to studying on her own, taking comfort in books and her solitude. In 1931, when Dorothy turned 27 years old, she moved to London against her parents' wishes and took to writing articles for an Egyptian public relations magazine. This was still a very volatile period between Britain and Egypt, though formally the British Empire declared Egyptian independence from the empire in 1922. They still occupied the country and occupied much of the affairs of the Egyptian government. Dorothy wrote an article promoting the independence of Egypt. And while she was writing for this magazine, she met a man named Imam Abdel Miguid. The day after their chance meeting, Abdul had to return to Egypt. However, they continued to communicate via letters, back and forth for about a year. And finally, in 1933, Iman wrote to Dorothy asking for her hand in marriage, to which Dorothy accepted. At age 29, Dorothy finally steps off of the boat in Egypt. She knelt down and kissed the ground and said, "Finally, I'm home." Unfortunately, her marriage was not smooth sailing, however. Iman's parents were quite well off and didn't really vibe with her headstrong attitude towards life. There was a lot of misogyny going around back then. She was very vocal about these past life experiences, and them being kind of skeptical and traditional, they did not believe her, and they did not like when she would bring up the subject. Then Dorothy fell pregnant and gave birth to a son that she named Sety. And it wasn't long after her arrival in Egypt that Dorothy would finally understand all of her faded memories of her past life in intimate detail. During the night, her husband would often awaken to find Dorothy standing by the writing bureau, frantically scribbling onto paper. And this is what Dorothy had to say about these occurrences as she reflected on them later in life. "Most of the time when I was writing, I was rather unconscious. as though I were under a strange spell, neither asleep nor awake. I was being dictated to. The gentleman who was narrating my story, his name was Ho-Ra, really took his time. He would tell me just a few words, then be absent for a fortnight or so, then come again, always at night, and relay to me a couple of other lines or episodes, and then after that, his voice would just die away. It was as though this Ho-Ra was bored to death, as if he were fulfilling a mission that filled him with loathing. Every night when he came, I felt as though something were shaking to wake me, just as in a dream. When I was writing the bits and pieces of the story, I felt I was hearing a soft voice without being able to see anybody. When I was being dictated to, I felt as if I could understand every word, but later on, when I started to decipher the scribblings, I found that they were quite difficult to understand. In fact, in the mornings when I woke up, everything seemed so vague, so uncertain. If I hadn't been so absolutely sure that it was my handwriting, I would have said that it was somebody else's. The bits and pieces were there, and when finally Ho-Ra stopped coming, I started to piece together what looked to me like a big jigsaw puzzle. This lasted for an entire year, in which Dorothy wrote over 70 pages of fractured hieroglyphic texts. For the whole period, she kept the fractured segments that she collected from Ho-Ra that she could make sense of, a secret from her husband. He had grown increasingly concerned about his new wife's behavior. With Ho-Ra's tale complete, however, Dorothy worked on translating, and with every new segment she would transcribe, the story of her past life became even more clear. After almost 30 years, she finally began to understand the meaning behind all of her strange dreams that she'd been experiencing for almost her entire life. And I'm gonna leave you on that cliffhanger right there. That was pretty much the first part of her life, and in the second video we're going to go over the second half of her life, when all of these mysterious segments and fragments and dreams all start to become more cohesive to her and make sense. So stay tuned for that, and subscribe to my channel, click that little notification bell if you want to be notified whenever I post, and thanks so much for watching. Stay weird, stay curious, and question everything.